Now we get to Principle 7. Repositories must look after the information they hold, which is really nothing more than a statement about the need for archiving and preservation. Obviously, a discussion of archiving and preservation is a much longer one than what we're going to get into here. We have an entire program in SILS to deal with those issues. But in the context of digital libraries, this means three things primarily: format migration, server migration, and control over provenance. And that applies both to digital objects and to their metadata. Format migration means that files get converted to new file formats over time to ensure that they remain usable by the latest tools that users are using. Right? A file may have started out its life as a GIF, been converted to a JPEG, converted to a JPEG 2000, converted to whatever is going to come next. Server migration means that if a server moves, all unique IDs, DOIs, or what have you, get updated to point to the new location. What I mean by control over provenance is controlling changes to files, preventing unauthorized access. Hacking, of course, is the obvious example, but not the only one, and enabling authorized changes. The repository access protocol that ARMS mentions never really came into existence because HTTP came to be used instead for pretty much everything. But the idea is that there need to be policies that govern what can and cannot be done with the objects in the digital collection, and policies to govern who can and cannot perform what actions on what digital objects. Which brings us to principle number 1. The technical framework exists within a legal and social framework. Or, as I tend to think of it, technology is easy, policy is hard. Of course, technology isn't easy, so you can just imagine how hard that makes policy. Copyright is the obvious example to illustrate this. And the Google Books case, whether or not you believe that Google Books is a digital library or not, it's not really relevant here. It's a good example of how copyright issues can really affect the implementation of a digital collection. Take ARM's quote: "The digital library will not thrive if legal liability for content is placed upon parties whose only function is storage and transmission." Now, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, for example, contains a safe harbor provision that says that as long as internet service providers adhere to certain guidelines, they're not liable if one of their customers infringes copyright. Right? In other words, if I make copyrighted materials available on my personal university website, UNC is not liable. Under certain conditions, it's complicated. But in the case of digital libraries, as ARMS writes, there need to be clear policies about who has permission to do what. ARMS mentions Kahn and Walensky, and never mind who they are for the moment, but what ARMS writes is the legal structure emerges from technical design. Would that it were so. Assuming that the law follows technology is, frankly, almost the definition of technological determinism. Perhaps it should be that way, but often it isn't. At least not in the short term. There's an interesting conversation to be had about the long-term effects of technology on society, but that's a discussion for another time. We're all familiar with the copyright issues around music, movies, ebooks, etc. Copyright owners want to maintain control over how content is used, which means that the metadata that controls use has to be inextricably linked to the content, or the content must be inextricably linked to the tools used to access it. In other words, there's no content without the control mechanism. But that violates Principle 3, separation between presentation and content. Okay, we're almost done here. Finally, Principle 2. Understanding of digital library concepts is hampered by terminology. What is a digital library? What is not a digital library? What's the difference between a digital library, a digital collection, digital archive, an institutional repository, etc.? Answer? It depends. ARMS uses some other examples: copy, publish, etc. I'd add the term library, which means something very different to a librarian and to a programmer. Clarity is important, especially in cross-disciplinary projects like digital libraries, because otherwise you find yourselves around a table having two different conversations using the same words. So one solution has been to invent new terms: institutional repository, information commons, etc. But that kind of just adds fuel to the fire. So other terms have had more persistence over time: digital object, metadata, etc. The term handle has been replaced by the term identifier, but that also has become a well-understood term now too. So I saved principles 1 and 2 to last. In other words, policy matters and names matter. And so I leave you with a question. Do these 8 principles separate digital libraries from other digital collections, museums, archives, etc.? I leave it as an exercise to the reader, so to speak, to think through how any or all of these principles play out in a digital collection at one type of a cultural heritage institution versus another.